găsit tuturor, sunt Marius Constantinescu. Astăzi, la ediție limitată, vin doi scriitori de primă pagină, de raft întâi, de listă de bestsellers, dar și de ierarhie critică, ambii publicați în România de Humanitas Fiction, Gwen Strauss și Colm Tóibín.
Gwen Strauss, thank you so much for accepting this conversation. And of course, we are going to talk about your book, The Nine, which has caused quite some stir in Romania as well, as it happened in many countries of the world. It's not just another story of the Holocaust, but it's a particular one because it concerns a different aspect, which is not exactly or not only the concentration or the labor or the death camp, but also the march from there towards liberation, towards a new phase in someone's life. Now, of course, this book is mainly historical truth, intertwined with some fiction, obviously. My first question concerns your first meeting of the actual story. How did that happen?
Yes, that was really sort of an astonishing part for me. I was having lunch with my great aunt Hélène Podliaski and with my grandmother. And Hélène was at that time in her 80s. I think she was around 83. And I had known her all my life as a very elegant, very discreet, and highly intelligent woman. And during that lunch, she started to tell me this story about her arrest and about her work in the resistance. And then she told me how she had escaped with a group of women, and I was just astonished because I didn't know any of that. I vaguely knew that she had been in the resistance, but really was not something we talked about in the family. So that was kind of I was so surprised.
Was she the one who started actually this conversation, this story? Yes?
Yes, yeah. And what's interesting about it too is that she hadn't talked about it with anyone in the family. I mean, perhaps she talked about it with my uncle, my great uncle, and probably my grandmother, but it wasn't something that we spoke about. And I know for a fact that her daughter, her own daughter, didn't know the story or anything about it. So she suddenly, I felt ready to talk about it 60 years later. And I asked if I could come to her apartment and record it because it seemed so important to me, this story, which I did with another member of my family. And we made a transcript, which she corrected, and then kind of left it at that. I didn't think initially that I would make a book out of it. I just thought I wanted to make sure the story wasn't forgotten.
You know, there is this different approach for everyone who has dealt with this kind of horror in telling the story, whether you have this availability in sharing the facts, in sharing the memories, in sharing also the sensations, the actual sensations, or on the other hand, is this extreme sometimes reluctance, because there is a certain fear that no one else could actually relate to or at least understand this kind of context, this kind of episode in one's life.
Yeah, I think that's especially true when you're talking about women, especially young women from her generation. There was definitely a taboo around the subject after the war, and it was something that many women just pretended hadn't happened because they didn't, for many reasons. I think partly the feeling was, as you said, nobody would, but other comrades would understand what they'd been through. And they initially faced quite a sort of backlash when they returned home and talked about it.
You had one story, Hélène's story, but in the book there are other 8 stories. How did you embark in the journey in order to discover these particular stories, to intertwine them?
Yeah, that was really the fun part for me. So I had Hélène's story, and 2 years after Hélène told me her story, I stumbled across a book that was written by another member of the group, the one who's called Zaza. And I didn't realize it was the same story. I mean, it seemed like the same story, but not quite. And there was no one named Hélène, and it was, so I gave it to Hélène to read, and she confirmed that indeed this was her friend Zaza, and that was the group, and that she was called Christine, and that she was known as Christine It was her nom de guerre, and that was how I would find her in the Nazi records as well. They knew her as Christine, not as Hélène. So from Zaza's book, I was able to find out that there were 9, because actually Hélène couldn't remember how many there were. And I was able to find out that there were 6 French and 2 Dutch and 1 Spanish, and a little bit about their ages and their nicknames. And then I slowly I took a trip to Germany, and I went into the archives and slowly was able to piece together who was who. Really, the big help also was when I started to contact the families of the women that I knew, and sometimes they would say, oh, that her real name is, for example, there was one named Mena, and I couldn't find her anywhere. And then when I found Gigi's family, they said, oh, but Mena's real name is Yvonne. And then they knew her, and I contacted her family. And so it sort of went like that, one after another. A lot of working in the archives, a lot of reading Nazi lists and sort of searching through transport lists and trying to piece together who could be the right age with sort of the right name and was in the same group. They were all together in the same block. So eventually I was able to figure it out, but it took some detective work, which was very exciting.
Exactly, that sounds like a journalistic investigation.
Yes.
Were there difficult parts? Have you at a certain point felt, I don't know, maybe impeded, maybe drawn back in your research?
There were several difficult. Of course, it's a difficult subject, and some of the research, specifically, I would say about Ravensbrück, which was the first camp that they were sent to. I figured out, and this is a camp that was built only for women, and is just an hour and a half north of Berlin, and is the second largest camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau, an enormous camp complex that was, by the end of the war, a death camp. There were gas chambers, and there was quite some, when they show up in the camp and the time that they're in the camp, the conditions were terrible there. And there was also terrible treatment to sexual violence, but also terrible treatment of pregnant women and terrible treatment of children. And that was very, very painful and difficult to read about and then to try to imagine in the lives of these women.
Well, as you have mentioned already, Ravensbrück was the second largest camp in that time. Still, if we think about the camps, the World War II camps in general, there's always one name that pops up more than anything else, which is Auschwitz-Birkenau. Okay, so basically, almost no one seems to be talking about Ravensbrück. Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, it's interesting, especially because, there's all kinds of reasons why. But I think again, going back to what I said earlier, one of the reasons that Ravensbrück was particularly forgotten and sort of erased somewhat from the history of the camps or the memory of the camps is that it was a camp only for women. And many of the women who survived, when they went home, didn't talk about it. And I suspect, and I'm pretty sure, for example, that one woman of the 9, José, I think she denied that she was ever there. So none of her family even knew that she was there. Because it was such a, marriages were called off, and it was just a taboo. Immediately after the war, Ravensbrück was on the, Eastern Germany, and it was, the Soviets flattened it. So they were going to build a shopping mall on it. A group of survivors in Germany, women, stopped that.
It's also, since you're talking about this camp only for women, it's also a book about an unseen and an untouched aspect of the Nazi extermination, which is the pregnant women that arrived in the camp and the children born within the camp.
Yeah, I would say that was the most difficult part of my research. The part where I would have to put down the research and walk away and go for a long walk in the woods and try to,
clear your thoughts.
Clear my thoughts, because there were some incredibly cruel things done to pregnant women, and and also to women giving birth, and then the children immediately afterwards. A lot of women arrived in the camp pregnant because there was a lot of rape of women by soldiers. So once they were there, they would find themselves pregnant. And then for a certain part of the time in the camp, you weren't allowed to have a child, so there were abortions carried out, obviously not well, and obviously women would die of those often, and they would be brutal and terrible. There was also then later in the camp, they allowed women to have children, but they didn't do anything for the children. So the children were put in a sort of maternity ward with no food and no real facilities, and so the children died. In fact, it's estimated that over 500 babies died during that time, basically starved to death. So it's very, very dark part of the story.
Yes, we all know from dozens and dozens of books or movies or documentaries or even first-hand accounts, the daily life within a camp, whether it was Auschwitz-Birkenau or Bergen-Belsen or Dachau or Treblinka or Ravensbrück. But still, your book is also about a specific time after the destruction of the camp, and this is something many tend to ignore or to forget. Most of us think that once the camps were liberated, everything turned out to be somehow fine, let's say. But then again, your book is about this march, this 10-day journey from Ravensbrück towards a certain destination that our readers will discover. What do we tend to forget about this post-liberation specific time?
Well, I mean, it was incredibly deadly and dangerous, first of all, because between the moments, this happens really in April, the factory where they've been forced to, as slave labor has been destroyed by the Allies. And so the Nazis have put their prisoners on these death marches that have been called death marches because over a third died during this very short period of the war, either in mass executions or they died from starvation. They just dropped dead. There was no food. There was no plan. Already Auschwitz had been emptied in January with the coming of the Russian troops. And many of those prisoners, some of those women, had ended up in the same labor camp with my group of 9 women.
Yeah.
So they knew this is what was that they were headed to. And once again, they get pushed out into this march. It's snowing, it's spring, but it's really cold. They have no real footwear. They're all sick. One has tuberculosis, one has diphtheria, one has a broken foot, the other has just recovered from pneumonia. They've already just spent over a year in concentration camps, malnourished, etc. So you can imagine and then there's no food and there's no water and there's Allied bombings and there's, the women decide at this point to escape from this death march because they know if they continue, they will be killed, which is in fact what happened to the women that stayed with the group. A few days later, we know historically that they were all killed in a field. And then it's just chaos. I mean, the countryside of Germany at this point is completely bombarded. There's no food. There's panicked Germans. There's fleeing SS. There's fleeing Nazis, German soldiers who hate the SS. There's the Russians coming from one side, the Americans or the Allies coming from the other side. So it's just it's almost like a Brechtian play, and they have to figure their way home. I think for me, it reminded me a little bit of Homer's Odyssey because it's sort of this story of a group of soldiers, because really these young women were soldiers trying to find their way home from a war. And that even, what was interesting for me is that even afterwards, when they finally get to Paris, it's not over. There's a kind of, how do you really come home from a war? How does one heal from a war? How does one come home? And again, what you were saying earlier is very true. They've had this really intense experience as a group of women together, as a group of friends. And maybe they're never going to have that kind of intense friendship again. There's a kind of loneliness as well when they get home, I think.
Născută în 1963 în Haiti, Gwen Strauss locuiește actualmente în Franța. Este autoarea unor cărți multipremiate de literatură pentru copii, este și poetă, iar eseistica și proza sa scurtă au apărut în publicații precum London Sunday Times sau New England Review. Bestsellerul internațional Cele 9 femei de la Ravensbrück, o poveste de supraviețuire în Germania nazistă, a apărut deja în 15 țări și este în negociere pentru realizarea unui serial de televiziune. Povestea este a lui Ellen Podliasky, strămătușa autoarei și a grupului alături de care a reușit să fugă dintr-un marș al morții.
There's no way none of us can actually put herself or himself into the shoes of someone who has lived the Nazi terror the way these survivors did. What have you learned about the resilience of the human soul working and writing on this book?
Yeah, I wanted to say that because I feel like I've been focusing too much on the dark side, because the other part of this journey for me as a writer was how amazing some of the stories of courage and self-sacrifice and really friendship, how important friendship was for them, sticking together. And I found that women, even in the camp and then in the labor camp and then even on the march, they found all kinds of ways of resisting that I wouldn't have considered resistance. You know, like for example, you read about in my book the reciting of recipes to each other.
Yes.
That was just a beautiful way of being together, and believe it or not, as they're starving, it's comforting for someone to describe every single step of making some kind of meal, and they would consider it as if they had eaten a meal together. Or they just did these beautiful acts of solidarity. They did poems and they stole paper, and there was room for art and creativity. In fact, art mattered. It was primordial for because resistance for them as women meant having, sticking together, having friendships, and having dignity as maintaining their humanity. And I was really moved by that. I moved by the creativity that they showed in finding ways to keep going.
I'm sure that you, as an author, have read many of these books. Most of them are worldwide famous. From the late 40s up until today, there are generations already of books and authors dedicated to this particular time in human history. But also from the point of view of the author, in which way did you feel that you have grown or mature as a writer within the boundaries of the story?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. First of all, it gave me a feeling that I hadn't had before, that it matters to tell stories, and that it matters to keep the stories alive and to pass them on. I'm of the generation that's a witness of the witnesses. I'm that almost all the survivors are passed away now. So we have to, these stories are of vital importance. The specific story, but also in the general story of humanity and resilience and friendship and solidarity and all those things. And I think I could be sort of somewhat blasé or cynical as a writer before. And then doing this story and meeting some of the families and bringing the stories to them and hearing their stories has made me realize that we as human beings, we need stories. That's like how we understand each other and how we have hope. And I believe that hope is sort of the radical act that we all need to try to generate. And so I feel like writing and keeping these stories alive is part of that.
It's not an easy book. It's not easy to read it. It's not easy to live up to a certain extent the lives of these 9 women. Were there moments in writing the story when you said to yourself that it was maybe too much, too hard to handle, that you wouldn't believe that you would last up until the end to write it?
Well, like I said, there were certain parts of the research that I found really hard to handle. I actually found writing it, believe it or not, it was a kind of a joyous thing, because it was one of these times as a writer where each story led me to another story, and I felt almost guided. Every time I hit a wall and didn't know what to do, or as I often have and continue to have, when I was really doubting myself and thinking, oh, I'm not capable of this. This is too important of a story for someone like me to be writing, or, who am I to be writing this, or, any of those kind of questions one can have. Something would happen. Some little, one of the relatives would suddenly an envelope would arrive in my mailbox with photographs that someone had sent me of one of the women. And I'd realize, like, oh, they're trusting me to tell this story. I have to keep going. So in a lot of ways, this experience was really a happy experience despite the subject, because I felt so empowered by the families of these women, and I kind of felt like the happy is not the right word, but it is a story of bravery and courage, and I felt proud to be able to tell it.
We may have the impression that about the Holocaust and about the Nazi extermination, everything was said. Still, look, there are books like yours that show us different aspects, different facets, different sides of this universal horror, probably the most important or the capital horror of the 20th century. Is there something always new to discover about such a well-known story?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it was something I have to admit that when I first started on this, it sort of held me back, because I thought, well, it's kind of already been told, and even my agent was sort of, another book about this. But what I did find, and I think is really true, is that there's a lot of stories of women that haven't been told, and there's a lot of the marginal people that haven't, and there is we always exist in relationship to history. It's not a set point and then you finish telling it, because history really exists only as we remember it, and our memory changes in relationship to where we are. So the story that we can tell today is not the story that we could have told 20 years ago, or what we can tell from 20 years from now. And that's kind of the beauty of storytelling, is that it is exactly what we need at each moment, and it's in play with memory, but memory is not a fixed thing, if that makes sense. I mean, so it's a constantly evolving, constantly moving. So yes, I think that there is an endless source of story.
Gwen, last question. What would Helen say about the book?
Oh gosh, that's so scary. She was a really incredibly intelligent, elegant, super well dressed.
Yes.
Everything.
You depict her so French, so classy, so refined, so poised.
Yeah, she was very humble. So I don't know how she would feel, but I hope that she would be happy and proud. I think she was very proud of her group of friends. So I hope so.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. It's wonderful, Marius. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cărțile irlandezului Colm Tóibín au fost publicate în peste 30 de țări, s-au aflat de 2 ori pe lista scurtă pentru Man Booker Prize, iar numele lui este cel al uneia dintre cele mai robuste voci auctoriale de pe ambele maluri ale Atlanticului. Cel mai recent succes al lui Tóibín este romanul Magicianul, o frescă simfonică și extrem de atașantă a vieții lui Thomas Mann. Iată că atunci când nici măcar nu se estompaseră bine ecourile acestui roman, Humanitas Fiction îl readuce pe Tóibín în atenția publicului din România prin publicarea cărții Casa Numelor, o reinterpretare plină de vigoare a mitologiei clasice.
Mr. Tóibín, thanks first of all for accepting this conversation for the Romanian readers. Now, getting back to your book, to the Romanian translation of The Magician, I have it here. Congratulations once again. What was it so enthralling about Thomas Mann to actually require a novel from you dedicated to him?
I suppose, beginning when I was in my late teens, I read most of his work. And I suppose at that time, I believed that writers, the art of being a writer, was a form of entitlement, of certainty, of power, of seriousness. which is why, in a way, most of the writers you saw were men. And most of the photographs were dignified people, and they seemed to be in control. It was really particularly the case with Thomas Mann, where he seemed a sort of a magisterial figure, that he knew a great deal about culture, and he wrote with great certainty. It was really only when his diaries appeared, which was in the beginning of the 1980s, say.
Yes.
He died in 1955, that everyone began to look at him, I think, in a new way, and began to see those very weak figures. Illness interested him, and weakness. I mean, Hanno in Buddenbrooks, for example, Dr. Aschenbach in Death in Venice, even Hans Castorp in Magic Mountain, even Adrian Leverkuhn, and the narrator in Zeitblum in Dr. Faustus. And that Mann himself wrote out of a sort of a radical uncertainty, a sort of instability, a sort of lack of entitlement. And I was interested in the gap between the figure who appeared on the platform, talking with great certainty about culture, and the figure who was alone in his study, who was a much more nervous, who was a much more uncertain figure. And that really in 1914, Mann became a militarist, Prussian, someone who wanted victory in the battlefield, which is not the man, that's not the figure we associate, that's not what we associate with the man of the 1920s or 30s or 40s. You know, it was a great change came over him politically. But he was also, in that way, is often described, a man of the center, meaning he was not left-wing. He was not especially right-wing either. He was almost apolitical until, of course, that became an impossible position for a German after 1914. So that there's so many, in a way, dichotomies, conflicts, ambiguities, that he is a fascinating figure for anyone, for a biographer. But a novelist, the effort will be to create an illusion that you are in the room with him, that you are in his mind, that you are living in the same time as he's living. I think that he's very open to that, because just one last thing, that the novel as a form is particularly good at letting the reader know what someone is thinking and then what someone is saying, and often the distance between those two things.
Well, we will talk some more about this particular aspect of Thomas Mann as depicted by you. I was curious if you have decided to dedicate him this novel, and it's quite an ample one, being more fascinated with his work or with his personality.
That's a great question. The answer is, the novel is really not an investigation of the novels. I'm taking the novels as there.
Yes.
So that he's so I mean, I'm not writing about all of the novels. I have no responsibility to do that. So, for example, Joseph and his brothers doesn't really get mentioned. It gets mentioned in passing in this book.
You're not an advocate for his novels, for his writings, actually, in this novel.
I'm interested in his marriage, for example. So, you know, in other words, my novel is in a way, it's closer to gossip than it is to literary criticism, and I'm not ashamed of that. I mean, maybe I should be ashamed of that, but I'm not. In other words, I'm interested in the life. Obviously, I have to take the work into account.
Just a second, I would interrupt you here, because maybe some of our viewers hearing you talk about gossip would probably think of a certain, I don't know, let's say, investigation from a sexual point of view of Thomas Mann's life. But then again, I would say your novel is succulent, but not juicy in that particular direction.
Yes, I'm using the word gossip provocatively and loosely. In other words, that the novel needs gossip more than it needs literary criticism. And in other words, if I define gossip as being information about someone's private life, that is not essential information, but information that really interests people, then a lot of novels use gossip more than they use philosophy, ethics, theology, or indeed literary criticism.
Well, what you're saying leads me to my next question, because at a certain point in the novel, talking about death in Venice, Katia, Thomas Mann's wife, well, she says that no one will see Venice as they used to before the publication of the novella. In a similar fashion, with Death in Venice, it appears that no one can dissociate this particular writing of the entire Thomas Mann persona. Is this writing, more than all the others, the filter that you use in order to perceive Thomas Mann as a writer, but also as a man?
Not exactly, because Buddenbrooks, which was his first book, is entirely autobiographical. In other words, his family had left Lübeck, where they had been for generations. They're now living in Munich. He has lost the idea of being a little prince on the street. All the buildings, the warehouses, the houses they owned in Lübeck, it's all gone to dust. And his job in Buddenbrooks is to resurrect that, is to recreate it in sentences, is to go back 3 generations. And so at the beginning of my books, at the beginning of The Magician, certainly that idea of losing something and then finding it again in words and sentences is, I think, the theme of those early chapters of the book. What happens later is that his wife writes a memoir when she's very old. And in that memoir, she describes being in Venice in 1911, the year before he published Death in Venice, with Tommy, as she calls him, and that he did stare, gaze, he did look at a boy on the beach. She says that happened. So you see, once I have that, then I have where I can connect the adventures in Venice to the book he wrote.
Well, as you have already mentioned, in my opinion as well, there are 2 spines of your book, of The Magician. One is Mann's sexuality, and the other one is his participation, or sometimes lack of participation, in the history, in the making surrounding him. Was he a spectator or a true actor of his time?
Oh, you're absolutely right. He was a spectator. And there's an element in my book in which he's a ghost, in which he's almost not there, in which when he comes into a room, his wife is talking, his daughter is talking, his brother, everyone's talking, everyone has an opinion, everyone is fully alive in the book. And Thomas Mann comes into the room, and often he doesn't speak, but he watches, he notices. And when he's in his study, he's writing. In this book of mine, he's mainly silent. But he's the only consciousness. So everything is seen from his perspective. What he notices, you notice. What he sees, what he remembers, what he feels. But he doesn't talk. It isn't a first person singular narrative, but it also isn't one in which he's constantly interrupting, or he's constantly engaged. He's often not engaged. He's often trying to withdraw, move away, be on his own. So, I mean, it was an interesting challenge to write a book almost about a character who's almost not there.
Does he pay this silence that he consciously chooses over public speaking, over being opinionated about the times he goes through?
I think part of the interest of his life is that this comes in 2 ways. That between 1933 and 1936, he did not openly, publicly denounce Hitler. The pressure on him to do so was enormous. More or less everyone, all the other writers in exile, had done so. His son wanted him to do so, his daughter wanted him to do so, and eventually it was pressure from his daughter, who really said, if you don't denounce Hitler, I mean, he was living outside Germany. He was just waiting and watching, and his books were still on sale. In that initial fire of degenerate books in Berlin, his books were not burned.
Yes.
And his books were still on sale in Germany in 1936. And so that 3-year period is certainly one where he's silent, he's watchful, he's waiting, he's not engaged. But then you take it a decade later, say in 1942, 43, well, he's in America. And because he's been a man at the center, Roosevelt, the president, trusts him, that he's not Bertolt Brecht, he's not a left agitator. And therefore, in those 2 or 3 years, he makes very beautiful and engaged speeches against Hitler, talking about democracy. That you're constantly having to recreate him, because he really recreates himself, or perhaps more truthfully, circumstances engaged to recreate him.
How do you see his intellectual status in relationship with the troubled times that Germany has to face during the two wars?
In 1914, he had begun thinking about The Magic Mountain, which he published finally in 1924, but he stopped writing the book. And every day, a man called Ernest Bertram would come round. I found at a sale in New York a photograph of Thomas Mann dedicated to Ernest Bertram. And Ernest Bertram was openly homosexual, was a scholar of Nietzsche, was much more scholarly than Mann. And Mann was trying to write a book where he could describe what it meant to be a German artist, meaning he could go back into the early 19th century and look at the roots of that in music, in philosophy, in poetry. He didn't have he never went to university. He wasn't a scholar. He read what he needed to read for everything he needed to do, which is a very typical novelist way of working with ideas. If you need something, go and get a book, read it. But there's always someone who knows much more. So Bertram knew much more. And Bertram became a Nazi later on. And after the war, Second World War, he was forbidden from ever teaching again, for example. So in those 4 years, Mann became a very grumpy figure domestically. Golo, his son, writes about this, that he really was irascible at the dinner table. And in his study, he was writing this book, which was published. Luckily, no one noticed it because it was published just as the war was ending. It was called Reflections of a Non-Political Man. And it is, I think by just saying it's not a good book, but it's a book that shows really how little skill he had as a political thinker, that he was not a political thinker and he was not a scholar. And it just gives you an idea of how much he was an artist, of how much he invented and imagined, how much he created.
Was he ever a victim, in your opinion?
Everyone was a victim in that period. In other words, like a lot of other people in France, Germany, England, and America, indeed, he was minding his own business in 1914. He would have gone through the next decade quite happily without a war. And everyone was a victim of 1914. And then much worse, everyone was a victim of Hitler.
Well, there is this everlasting, I would say, Saturnian melancholia surrounding Mann's figure, always rhymed, of course, with Mahler's harmonies. And everyone remembers the famous Adagietto from the Fifth Symphony, used by Visconti in his Death in Venice movie. In your book as well, I would say, he advances through time and also through different periods of his life in a titanic way, I would say. We don't see him getting old. He doesn't age, or if he does age, he does it gracefully. He seldom shows vulnerability, and he's scared only a couple of times. Was he a great man, as great as his writings?
I suppose we asked the question, what is a great man? And is there any man who is a hero in his domestic space? In other words, this novel is a domestic novel. It isn't set in the trenches. It isn't set in the universities or the lecture halls or even the cafes. It's very much drawing room, dining room, study. It's wife and daughters and sons. And, in that sense, he's often at a loss. But that's important because his characters are often at a loss. He does plan to write novels about Frederick the Great, and he does plan that. But his best characters are his most vulnerable ones, are his most uncertain ones. In other words, Aschenbach in Death in Venice is not a heroic scholar. He's a very uncertain, solitary figure who has moved away from sensuality towards some dryness of the spirit. And of course, when he comes then to writing Dr. Faustus, He is writing about people who are, the sheer braveness of Adrian Leverkusen versus the narrator, who's the humanist who has stayed behind in Germany, who is a very cautious figure. So those two parts, those two, I suppose, elements, the cautious and the outlandishly brave, man was locked between the two, and in a way he was neither. And that's what gave him his genius. In other words, his genius came from his uncertainty.
How do you write about such an influential writer? How do you find a voice that is equally convincing, loud, and seductive for your reader, depicting such a great figure?
I think seductive is good, but loud is not. So it is very much a book written in whispers. In other words, that it is about his private life. It is about his marriage. It is about himself alone. So the whole idea of greatness is just not there. It is really, I think I would hope, a book about private things, and therefore the loudness won't work. What I'm looking for, I suppose, is a sort of intimacy. It is a sort of sense of what his demons are, and his demons, of course, are loss. I mean, having lost Lübeck, lost his father, lost the importance that came with being one of that family, and of course, his demons are sexual demons. In other words, that his desires are forbidden. His desires will ruin him if they were known about. And so that everything has to be very carefully managed.
What makes him a modern writer even today?
Oh, I don't think he himself would have realized that if you want a modern writer in this period, you look to Kafka, you look to Robert Musil, and that he was locked very much in the 19th century. And his struggle in something like Dr. Faustus was to emerge from the 19th century, to try and start working with parody, with pastiche, with elements that were experimental in the form of the narrative, that he deliberately sought to move into the 20th century. But if you look at Buddenbrooks, even if you look at the form of Death in Venice, you really are looking at a late 19th century form. And I think he was conscious that if you're looking for a contemporary moment in fiction, I think he looked to Kafka. And the thing is, when I was 17 and I came to University College Dublin, this is 1972, the Magic Mountain was all the rage. It was really, really fashionable. And if you wanted to, be with a certain group of people, you really had to have read that book. I mean, more than Ulysses, more than James Joyce, in the same way as you're watching Godard films or Bergman films, that this was fashionable. That's no longer the case. Fashions change, things move. And Thomas Mann has moved, I think, out of fashion, certainly in America, so certainly in the English-speaking world. It doesn't mean people don't read him, but he hasn't got the same importance as he once had.
Well, a New York Times quoted about your novel that is a symphonic novel, and I find this musical approach extremely suited for the topic of our talk, and also for your writing. If your novel, if The Magician, had a soundtrack, what would that be?
Oh, I suppose it would have to be, it would really be pre-Mahler, and it would be, I suppose, the Schubert songs. Those melancholy, slow Schubert songs, the songs from Winterreise, other Schubert songs like that. In other words, I don't see the thing as symphonic because it is gentle in the study of a personal conscience in this period. It doesn't go into the big Tolstoyan, massive parties and events that are going to change history. He's always one step away from that. The novel doesn't occur in Sarajevo. He finds out about Sarajevo from his children. Mm-hmm. And so it's, I would think of it as a much more German art song with slow piano accompaniment, rather than the big Mahlerian massive orchestra making this incredible sort of sugary or soothing, whatever word you want to use, sound. So yeah, I would think of it as a much, much more modest enterprise than a symphonic one.
Mr. Tóibín, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
I hope to see you soon, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Doamnelor și domnilor, o altă ediție limitată se închide aici. Eu sunt Marius Constantinescu, trăiți nelimitat.